stop slipping and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com. 100% vegan and the only football boots that come in a takeout container. More seriously though, I wanted to revisit the Sokito Scudetta, which I have here in 2 different colorways, the first of which is this gorgeous Brazilian themed colorway. These remind me so much of those R9 Mercurial Vapor 3s with the yellow upper that fades to green at the heel with the Sokito branding in black as an accent, along with not the latest, but one of the newer colorways in stone gray and volt yellow, a football boot that normally would retail for $200, but this particular colorway can actually be had on sale right now for around $150. And for that kind of money, you would be hard pressed to find a better pair of speed boots. Which is more or less what I want to discuss in today's video, because while I wouldn't really argue that the Scudetta is the best speed boot in any one area in particular, I think as an overall product, it's extremely well-rounded and, dare I say, has gone a little bit underappreciated just because they don't have the marketing power of the big guys in Nike, Adidas, and to a lesser extent these days, Puma. Not to mention, they've actually gone and improved something that I complained about in my original review, which is something that we don't often see any football boot brand do within the same model. We're gonna go over what I think is really good, some areas where I think there is some definite room for improvement, and of course take a look at how they fit and feel on feet, where even though this is not a mainstream choice in the speed boot category, depending on what you're looking for, it might actually be the best option for you that you never even considered. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, and if you are interested in scooping a pair well below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes, be sure to check out that first link down below. And as always, if you guys enjoy the content on the less popular brands, don't forget to drop a like on the video, and if you appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. So because I have already reviewed the Scudetta, I'm going to structure this review a little bit different, where we're going to talk about something that I think is really good and then something that I think is not necessarily bad, but could use a little bit of tweaking to be that much better. Starting with what I think is fantastic, and that is the Biotech upper. This material is very reminiscent of that hybrid touch synthetic that we used to get on the 2014 F50 Adizero all those years ago. Maybe a little bit thicker than that, and also maybe a little bit softer, and even with some grip texture on the surface so it's not super slippery on the ball. Regardless, both against your foot as well as when it comes to general feel for the ball, the touch is fantastic if you're looking for something that is really thin, but at the same time isn't lacking in softness and that slight bit of cushion to take the edge off. And then for the sake of added structure, while also saving on weight, you can see the transition from that Biotech into more of like a textile-based synthetic material as you go through the midfoot and heel area on both the lateral and medial side. Admittedly, it's not as structured as what you're going to find from a lot of speed boots, which does to a certain extent compromise the general responsiveness of this boot, at least in regards to how it feels compared to something like, say, a Mercurial as an example. But if you have more responsiveness and more structure to the upper, you typically sacrifice comfort, where I think Sokito definitely erred on the more comfortable side as far as how they decided to structure the material of this upper, which personally I'm okay with. Something that I'm not as in love with is the tongue of the Sokito Scudetta, where obviously they've opted for a more traditional construction with a central lacing system and a U-throat design that of course includes a standalone tongue. That is nice in that it's thin, if not thinner than the majority of the upper, meaning that it's not taking away from your touch on the ball, but with the laces kind of undone and with the tongue out, you can see that it basically has no structure to it whatsoever. The bottom part is made from that same BioTouch material as what you'll find in the forefoot, and then it transitions into this really soft and super thin kind of synthetic microfiber material that does have some fuse on the surface to help hold a little bit of structure, but for the most part, as you can see, it's very, very flimsy. And when you put the boots on, it's very evident that the tongue is purely there just to stop your foot from being exposed to the open air, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing from a barefoot feel perspective. This is the thinnest part of the upper without question, but you definitely find that when putting the boots on, it kind of bunches up a little bit weird, so you're always fiddling with the tongue to get it to lay flat. And it's also really, really short. Had they made it just a smidge longer, it would have been easier to adjust and at the very least, just a little bit less annoying, where if I were to make a change here, I think if the entire tongue, like the bottom section, was the same biotech material as the forefoot, not only would it make for a little bit more consistency in terms of touch on the ball, it would also give this tongue that added structure that I think is so important to make a more traditional U-throat design with a standalone tongue just feel better. Where don't get me wrong, it's not a deal breaker, and it's pretty clear that they were just trying to keep this area of the upper as thin and lightweight as possible. But the tongue, if you're going to do a U-throat construction, is a very important element. And again, I just think they could have done a better job. Moving back to what I think is really good, the FG stud pattern, where by the way, there's been a lot of demand for an AG variant of the Sokito Scudetta, and they are apparently coming out with that very, very soon. So look forward to that being featured on the channel at some point, hopefully in the very near future. But as far as their FG layout is concerned, what I like about it is that relative to a lot of other speed boots, it's actually pretty unique. Not in the sense that it uses bladed studs, we see that on most speed boots these days, but they're more of a straight edge blade that kind of just run along the outside edges of the forefoot and heel, which is kind of reminiscent, honestly, of the TRX bladed stud pattern days from Adidas, which we used to see on the Predator series, on early F50s, and honestly, almost everything that they made at that point in time. Where if you were a fan of what I think many would argue was a golden era for Adidas football boots, and or just like kind of more simple bladed stud patterns, this is again on par from a traction, feel, and performance perspective with just about any speed boot currently on the market. Stud pattern aside, something that I did complain about with the Sokito Scudetta back when it first came out, this being the OG white, red, and black colorway, was the sole plate itself, which is supposed to be responsive like you'd expect from a top-end speed boot, but when force is applied, the weak point in the sole plate is directly in the midfoot. That's where it's going to buckle, and while this forefoot piece is nice and stiff and you expect it to spring back, if it's going to buckle in the midfoot, it kind of negates all of that energy that's supposed to be stored and then sprung back into your feet as you're running. However, on these newer colorways, Sokito have modified the sole plate to where that is no longer the weak point, meaning that it's just stiffer through the midfoot and you still get that kind of stiffness through the forefoot. In other words, the boot stores energy and returns it far more efficiently to where now you can actually feel at least a little bit of that spring back effect. Is it the most responsive sole plate on the market? Absolutely not. And is it going to make you faster in any way whatsoever? Once again, probably not. But from a feel and design perspective, this is a definite improvement that Sokito never really talked about, didn't really have to fix if we're being completely honest, but I really do appreciate that on the newer colorways, the sole plate has been reinforced in the right spots. And then there's the weight, where especially when it comes to something in the speed category, the boot having a super lightweight construction does have an impact on the overall feel and experience. Typically, the lighter the better. So how does the Scudetta stack up against its main competition in the Vapor 16 Elite? And I have here also just a regular F50 Elite. These two in a size 9.5 US, this Scudetta in a size 10 because they do run a little bit small. I'll throw them all on the scale starting with the Scudetta, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 212 grams. We'll change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the F50s, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.6 ounces, the equivalent of 188 grams. We'll change the scale back to ounces one last time, and we'll throw on the Mercs, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.6 ounces, or 187 grams. Where of course 212 grams isn't necessarily heavy, but compared to the more popular alternatives that granted are also more expensive, they are carrying an extra 25 grams, which I would argue is a noticeable amount of weight, where you're going from something that is relatively light to something that is really light in both the Mercs and the F50s. In other words, if your boots being as light as possible is super important to you, these may not be the right choice, but if you don't care as much about a few extra grams, I think the extra comfort from the Scudetta might be worth your while. We're speaking of comfort and fit. This is definitely an area where I think the Scudetta is a definite standout, especially in the speed boot category, where I think logical comparisons as far as upper material would go would be something like the Messi F50 Elite. However, I think this is a far more comfortable football boot than the Messi F50s, both out of the box as well as once they're broken in. This Biotech upper, and honestly, just all the materials they've used are just so pliable and have a level of softness that you really don't see very often in the speed boot category, where I think if you like that tight fit of a speed boot, but you also don't want a restrictive sensation in terms of the upper being too structured, the Sokito Scudetta strikes a really nice balance of those two elements. Having said that, it is also a very low profile and relatively low volume fitting football boot. Plenty of depth in the heel, the lockdown is fantastic there, but through the midfoot, forefoot, and toe box area, it's a very slim profile overall, which is why I think the boot has such a nice silhouette, and because of the very pliable and slightly stretchy materials that they've used, they definitely get away with that kind of lower profile shaping that if the materials were firmer, the boots would probably just feel a little bit too tight. But generally, in terms of wrapping your foot as closely as possible, again, I'd make the argument that this is one of the best options currently on the market. What this also means is, from an overall width perspective, if you need a ton of it, particularly through the toe box area, you may find these to maybe be a little bit too tight, but at the same time, they do stretch a little bit as you wear them in, or as long as you want that tight fit, I do think they'll work for most people, and of course have that ability to expand because of the more traditional U-throat design and deep central lacing system. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in a size 10 US, which is half a size larger than I wear in the vast majority of football boots, and that's partially because not so much of the length, but the super low volume in the toe box area, where I've worn these now in both a 10 as well as a 9.5. And while I can get away with my usual 9.5, they are a little bit tighter than I would personally like them to be. So, like I said in my initial review, for the vast majority of people, unless your boots are just too big right now to begin with, going up half a size from a Mercurial or an F50 probably isn't a bad idea. Where I guess my whole point in making this video is not to say that the Sokito Scudetta is the best speed boot on the market, because that simply isn't true. But I do think it's pretty well as good and as well-rounded as any speed boot currently on the market, with some definite room for improvement. But if you consider all the factors as well as its much lower price tag than certainly the most popular options out there, especially on sale for in and around 150 bucks, the price to performance ratio that these have on offer is pretty compelling.